Thank you, Carla. Happy New Year to everybody. It wouldn't be possible without the team. I always say that. Today is a very symbolic anniversary and sad anniversary, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Larry Diamond. You've read the bio. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Mosbacher, I hope I'm reading that correctly, senior fellow in global democracy at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He has served as advisor to numerous governmental international organizations at various points in his life, including the United States Department of State, United Nations, World Bank, U.S. Agency for International Development. He is the founding co-director of the National Endowment for Democracy, very important journal of democracy. His research focuses on democratic trends and conditions around the world and on policies and reform to defend and advance democracy. He wrote more books than I could ever remember, the latest of which is Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. What I want to say about him is that his scholarship is encompassing in trends and personal, in telling the stories of individual people involved in them and in the struggle for democracy. He weaves democratic theory and detailed geopolitical details with a life of commitment to democracy in all levels, as a thinker, professor, advocate, and citizen. And he is also one of the main authors that I read when I was studying political science in Buenos Aires, trying to make sense of democracy and authoritarianism, not only theoretically, but also as I was personally trying to figure out how to build a democratic society in my own country after a brutal dictatorship. It is an honor to have you here, Larry Diamond, in such a significant day.
Thank you very much, Mara. It's an honor to be with someone who helped to reconstruct Argentine democracy. So
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't go that far. So there is a lot to talk about today, but I want to start a little bit like rewinding, and you talk in your book Ill Winds, and then we can just move on to more current affairs, about waves of democratization. So I would like, to ask you about these waves of democracy and when they start to decline and why.
Well, a wave of democracy is simply a period of time in which more countries become democratic than cease to be democratic. And the waves happen for a variety of historical reasons. A big factor could be, a new wave of economic development that eventually brings change, as it did, for example, in Korea and Taiwan. And maybe a little bit of a way in Latin America as well. A wave usually is facilitated by changes in global power and activity, in the positive and in the negative direction. In the positive, to speak directly to your national experience, I think that a lot of the so-called third wave of global democratization that began in the mid-1970s had to do with the development in the United States in the mid-1970s, the end of the extremely realist, cynical, and dictatorship-embracing foreign policy of Nixon and Kissinger and administrations before them, and the rise of a new American president and philosophy, Jimmy Carter, who put pressure on human rights, put emphasis on human rights, and therefore pressure on dictatorships like the Argentine military dictatorship to respect human rights. And this continued in a different way under Reagan, obviously with some contradictions, but ultimately some significant pressure on authoritarian regimes. And the reorientation of American foreign policy and activity in the European Union and so on helped to converge with domestic pressures of resistance to authoritarian rule and social, economic, and cultural change. But this international activity and trend can work in reverse. And now we see the retreat of the West, the crisis of Western and particularly US democracy, and the rise of Russia and China as new authoritarian powers with great ambition and energy and propagandistic momentum. And this is feeding into the domestic troubles of democracy in Africa and parts of Latin America and Asia and so on and so forth.
Yeah, you say that there's a great variation also in the world, in institutions, there's a spectrum of democracy, and sometimes democracies erode gradually until they, kind of break. Suddenly you realize it's a little bit like Machiavelli's Fortuna, right? I don't mean to make a misogynist, analogy here, but sometimes you cannot see it until, you see it from behind, that it has broken. How do you see that happening gradually? I mean, the Freedom House saw the US democracy degrade from 2010 to 2020, right? Which were the indicators, and how is this assessed in the US and how it affects, the rest of the world?
Well, if you look at the Freedom House data or other annual reports from the Economist Intelligence Unit and elsewhere, you see that we've been in a long trend of what I call democratic recession, that probably began around 2006 or 2007, was certainly accelerated by the global financial crisis that was really ignited by the American financial crisis and all of the corruption and failure of regulation in the subprime mortgage lending industry in the United States, and then was accelerated by deepening inequality due to globalization and other factors and deregulation, accelerated by the polarizing impact of social media and so many other things we could talk about. So we're now into more than a decade and a half of what is now an accelerating trend of democratic recession. And the recession or decay or failure of democracy manifests itself in different ways in different countries. Some countries have simply become more illiberal and less respectful of minority and human rights, or corruption is creeping back into government. In other cases, like Turkey, they've long since crossed the line into authoritarian rule. And I think Hungary as well. Poland has been heading in that direction, but is probably still a democracy. So India, I'm very worried about now, because there is an extremely illiberal, religiously chauvinistic, and I think bigoted prime minister in Narendra Modi, who is showing also authoritarian and illiberal tendencies. And then, of course, we can talk about at great length, I hope, the United States. So it doesn't look the same everywhere, but I think a common factor in the rollback of democracy in most of the world in the last 15 years is that it's not, for the most part, been happening the way it happened in Argentina, I guess in the early 1970s or late 60s, and the way it happened in Brazil in 1964, and in Chile in 1973, and in the Philippines in the late 1960s. you don't get a leader basically announcing the end of democracy, or I'm going to be a dictator, or something like that. You don't get an executive coup. You don't get a military coup. What you get is a gradual strangulation of democracy by a playbook that I call in my book, Ill Winds, the autocrat's 12-step program. And, you know, they go to work gradually to delegitimize opposition, to delegitimize the media as fake news, to intimidate the business community, to take over independent state institutions, to stack the court with political loyalists, and eventually, you know, they just have hegemonic control.
Yeah, it was mentioning the difference between electoral democracy and liberal democracy, because democracy seems to be sometimes an empty signifier. And when we talk about democracy, you know, it may mean different things. Electoral, well, it's electoral when you have, you know, not even fair and open elections, but, you know, liberal democracy is the guarantee of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, you know, independent judiciary, etc., etc. You mentioned in your book that, you know, democracy ultimately lies on culture and on democratic legitimacy, right? And so trust and belief are at the core of democracy. So when you believe in democracy, you sustain democracy, and when you don't, you don't. It seems to be like, in a way, a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But a self-fulfilling prophecy that because of beliefs, it may be very fragile. Would you speak to that?
Well, yes. I mean, you've spoken so well to it, so eloquently, that I'm not sure how much more I need to say, but I'll elaborate on it in this way. In the end, I think no constitution is self-enforcing. You know, the old line of the autocrat that it's just a piece of paper, or to put it in a different way, you know, from another famous autocrat, how many troops does the Pope have? You know, all he in the end has is faith. So in the end, you could say all we have is norms, all we have is values, all we have is beliefs. If nobody believes in and is willing to honor the Constitution, you can have the most beautiful Constitution in the world, and it will be shredded in practice. Democracy rests on a set of master norms of mutual respect, mutual trust, and mutual restraint. Each contending political party, or in the United States, each of the two great sides in this political struggle, have to respect the right of the other, or of any rival political party or critic, to contest, to oppose, to criticize, and so on. There's no one hegemonic answer. Each side has to have some degree of trust that if the other comes to power, it's not gonna be a permanent development. They're not going to eliminate the opposition. The rules of the game will continue, and if they then lose an election, they'll leave power and there'll be rotation of power. And so each side has to exercise in power and also out of power restraint in the methods they use. This is what Levitsky and Ziblatt in their book, How Democracies Die, call mutual forbearance, mutual restraint. These norms are virtually gone in the United States today. They're certainly badly eroded, particularly under the authoritarian political action and party leadership, and for 4 years government leadership of Donald Trump, and now of his advocates and disciples at the state level, who are busy, whenever they have the power and opportunity, rewriting state laws about elections, election administration, who can vote, and so on, in ways that I think are doing severe damage to this necessary culture of democracy, of mutual respect, mutual trust, and mutual restraint. And once that goes, all you have is, the naked struggle for power, a war of all against all. And democracy doesn't survive in an atmosphere of war, of political warfare, and zero-sum politics.
Yes, to that point, already in 1975, Hannah Arendt wrote about the crisis of the Republic and what she saw about elements that were eroding, right, the polity, and there has been increasing institutional weakness, right, and a constitutional design that functioned, but that had built-in, one can say vulnerabilities, but other people can say actually a clear restraint of the majority. That was certainly, Madison's intention, right? Just to keep the majorities, from power. So with all these elements, how is it that it comes to the brink of the abyss, right now, and what is there to do right now?
Well, let me say first that we face some deep structural dilemmas and contradictions. Madison and his fellow democratic theorists and founders in the constitutional drafting of the first democratic constitution of a modern nation state feared pure democracy. And so they designed a political system that, first of all, they called a republic because of the indirect nature of many aspects of American democracy, including the indirect election of the Senate until the early 20th century, and the Electoral College and so many other things that we know about, and with all the checks and balances and breaks on political action that we have. And while these, for a time, mitigated the danger of the rise of precisely the kind of figure who is threatening American democracy now, they were also undemocratic by removing the ability to choose and replace leaders from direct popular control, and opening the possibility that someone could become president who was not favored even by a plurality of the American public, not to mention a majority. But because the American Constitution is so difficult to amend, we've been stuck with these institutions. We can't change the undemocratic, unrepresentative, distorted nature of the Senate. The most we could do, frankly, is add more states. We can't get rid of the Electoral College, which I think is an increasingly offensive institution to democratic principles, although there is a potential legislative workaround that states have been pursuing. And it's just very, very hard and slow to change the American system. Madison and his fellow drafters designed it to have very heavy brakes and a very timid engine. And so it's slow and ponderous and riddled with checks and balances that become what my colleague Frank Fukuyama has called a vetocracy. At the same time, some of this is easier to change than other aspects of it. And the easiest to change in a way would be the Senate filibuster. All it takes is 50 votes plus one in the Senate to change any Senate rule. And, you know, if we don't get at least a modest change in the filibuster to permit a pure majority vote on legislation to defend American democracy, we are at risk of losing American democracy. And that existential moment may come as soon as the next couple of weeks if Chuck Schumer puts the Freedom to Vote Act on the Senate floor and tests whether Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema will vote no or yes on the Senate filibuster for that one item. I do note, however, I favor eliminating the filibuster, not only for that measure, on everything. I would just eliminate it. But it isn't going to happen. They're certainly not going to go there. And I do note, once you do that, you know, it is very possible that Republicans will not only win the House, that's pretty likely, but the Senate as well, that's slightly likely. And then that Donald Trump will be reelected again in 2024. And once that happens, if there's no filibuster, there's no defense. Republicans will be able to do anything they want if they can get 51 Senate votes. So, you know, progressives should bear that in mind when they advocate for the elimination of the filibuster. And a lot of principled resistance to eliminating the filibuster among Democratic senators who are willing to vote to suspend it for the Freedom to Vote Act, but are wary of indiscriminately, permanently lifting it for everything, follows from this fear of what could happen in 2025.
It's the logic of responsibility versus the logic of conviction, right? You know, opposing the principle that that is not good for the Constitution as a whole, but, you know, looking at the political field, what could bring, you know, down the line. I wanted also to ask you whether, you know, by constitutional design, I mean, there has been a built-in duality in the US Constitution. One is, you know, this republic as opposed to democracy. So while it poses itself to be the democracy in the world, it's not so much so. And it's built also, you know, on exclusion and racism. And not only that, on the if not enshrining, I don't want to say that, but acceptance of violence, right? And not the monopoly of violence in the hands of the state in the form of the right to bear arms, militias, you know, throughout the history. So the issue is like all these tensions were already present and coming to a full explosion, and they were contained within, you know, the democracy as it was functioning, or the republic as it was functioning.
Yeah, well, and, you know, there's so much that comes into clearer perspective when you look back in American history. We have a history of violence and a history of conspiracy theorizing, and a history of, frankly, fighting a civil war to preserve one of the most odious institutions ever imposed on human society, namely slavery. And those historical legacies continue to bear very strongly on the present. You know, I am in the process of reading now Evan Osnos's absolutely remarkable book, Wild Lands, The Making of America's Fury. And he reminds us of and cites a lot of literature that probes how violent American democracy was in various periods, both before the Civil War and after. At one point, the Senate was, or the Congress, the floor of the Congress was such a dangerous place because of physical violence and threats that, you know, foreign diplomats were advised not to go near it. And, you know, it needs to be said, most of this was coming from Southern senators and members of Congress who were, you know, steeped in maybe more of a culture of authoritarianism and violence because of the institution of slavery. And then you've got all of the right wing, you know, I grew up in an era, I lived in Southern California, and Southern California, namely Orange County, was home to the John Birch Society. You're probably too young to remember or know about the John Birch Society. But these were a group of, you know, right-wing McCarthyite lunatics who probably thought Joe McCarthy was, you know, the second incarnation of Christ. And these people, I feared greatly, you know, what would happen to the United States if people like this ever came to power. And they weren't the only ones. Of course, we have a long history of mobilization by the Ku Klux Klan and other extremely violent, right-wing, anti-immigrant, hateful groups. Well, you know, back then, these groups, the KKK, the John Birch Society, the Minutemen, they were dangerous, and often they were armed, but they didn't have the internet. They didn't have the ability to transmit conspiracy theories on the wholesale scale and with the lightning speed that social media does today, and the ability of, you know, people who, for whatever the psychological reasons may be, are inclined toward conspiracy theorizing, to find one another and dig out this stuff proactively as readily and massively as happens today. And frankly, we didn't have anything like the number of guns in the society that we have today, and the ready availability of them and the ability to carry them, and the National Rifle Association celebrating them, and the lunacy in not being even able to regulate military style weaponry, you know, automatic assault rifles and so on. So the situation today is far worse, far more dangerous than in any of those previous periods. And you've now got a situation where you've got several million people, according to the analysis of the University of Chicago political scientist Robert Pape, who's been doing and analyzing public opinion survey evidence on this, possibly as many as 8 million people who not only believe that Donald Trump was rightfully elected president in 2020, but who believe it's right and necessary to use violence to reverse what they perceive to be the injustice of that. And of these 8 million, many are former military officers, many are heavily armed. And, you know, some of them showed up and did what we saw done a year ago today.
Yes, and isn't this aligning along kind of this duality, this tension that founded the republic? Because it seems like the two parties aligning, you know, with this existential threat that was at the inception of the U.S. Republic, right? These two sides see each other as like a denial of their way of life or of their being. So there's this paradox that you mentioned in your article between when democracy is at the most need of forging a majority and a coalition, it is when it is most polarized, right, and more existentially divided. So how do we go past that? You wrote about this in an article that was published today in Foreign Affairs.
Well, again, as I said there, it's kind of a contradiction, an agonizing and painful one. But I think the situation we are facing is very, very grave. I think this is a way of framing it that I think may be useful to you, Mara, or meaningful to you, given the part of the world that you come from. I think we are in a situation today very, very similar in some ways to Chile in the late 1960s and early 70s in terms of the toxicity of the political polarization and the danger of democratic implosion. Obviously, in our case, the implosion would not be driven by the military as it was in Chile. It would come in a different way. And I use that instead of, Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, because the minute you raise any comparison to the rise of the Nazis, it triggers all sorts of reactions about the unacceptability of comparing anything to the ultimate tragedy of human history. But whatever the analogy, we're at a pretty late hour in terms of the breakdown of American democracy. So I'm just going to be blunt about it here, and I'm increasingly of the conviction that I've got to be blunt, including to many friends, who are on the Democratic or progressive side, which is more or less where I locate myself as well. The House is on fire now. We're facing an emergency. We don't have the luxury of thinking about, how we'd like to have that House be as perfect and admirable as possible. We need to put out the fire. The fire cannot be put out if Democrats lose the presidency in 2024. I just can't put it more directly than that. Because if Donald Trump comes back to power, especially by fraud, which there's a real possibility of, but even if he's reelected, he's not going to tolerate the restraints that he kind of reluctantly accepted for the first, 3 years and 10 months of his presidency. And those were bad enough. He's going to pick up where he left off, and you'll have a situation where, Michael Flynn will be National Security Advisor again. Crazy people will be running the Department of Justice and Defense. He'll fire everybody in the intelligence community and the FBI who won't bend to his will. And we could have a very, very rapid slide, not into an illiberal situation, but into authoritarianism. And so we have to build a very broad coalition to bring in people who don't admire Trump, even though they'd like to see less regulation and lower taxes in general, for whom this specter, is one of concern. They don't dismiss it, but they also don't want what they see to be a radical socialist wing of the Democratic Party to come in and impose socialism defund the police, impose cancel culture, or all the other things that they associate with the most progressive end of the Democratic Party. And if the Democratic Party does not somehow rally around a broad coalition and a ticket that can appeal to these kinds of swing voters, while still giving hope and inspiration to young people and minorities and so on, the prospect for American democracy is very frightening. And that's going to involve people deferring some of their wish list for political change and rhetorical mobilization.
Yeah, there's so many elements in what you just mentioned, and I'm glad you brought up the broad coalition, and I'm thinking about these possessed levels of deprivation and dispossession, and to build a new coalition, you need to appeal to different cleavages. I mean, the discourses as they are right now, they don't work, and you mentioned that in the article, that identity politics is not going to do the trick. And I tend to agree with that, while acknowledging the historical needs, right, to level the playing field, which brings me to a question of the relationship between, democracy and capitalism, if I may, because the savage capitalism that excludes people from the market, it's only fertile to this kind of, demonizing and othering discourses, right? So that's one element. And the other element is more kind of practical, if you wish, and it has to do with institutional design and the kind of reforms, that you can put forward. So these are two parts of the questions, but, you write, extensively about ranked choice voting. So I would like you to address, both parts. The economy, it's about the economy and building new coalitions, but also institutional design.
Okay, well, let me take them both in sequence. On, my colleague at New America, Lee Drutman, has been writing about the polarization in American politics and what he calls the doom loop in our politics, and making the point that I think is, many have made, and it's fairly obvious, that we really, have two lines of big cleavage in the United States, not one. One is left-right in terms of economic fairness and inclusion versus government deregulation and letting the market run amok and produce the obscene concentrations of wealth that we now have in the United States. Another line of cleavage is cultural. It's identity. It's abortion, gay rights, guns, scope for religion in the public sphere, and everything else. With the caveat that I don't think we should do anything to accept racism and racial exclusion and that sort of thing. But with that caveat, I think as a general rule, and I'm not saying we should just accept these extreme abortion laws, the anti-abortion laws that are being anti-choice laws that are being passed in places like Texas. But I think pushing an assertive identity agenda that's going to try and keep moving the boundaries forward and injecting, as a prominent theme, language like defund the police, or making big issues about, whether we have single-sex bathrooms or not. I mean, I have strong views about gender equality, transgender accessibility and so on. But there's a point beyond which, if this is the a main theme of your campaign, it's going to drive away people that we could rip away from the Trump coalition by making the issue squarely an issue of economic justice and economic inclusion and economic growth. And in this sense, I do think Carville was right in 1992 when he crafted the theme for the Clinton campaign. It's the economy, stupid. And I urge people to go back to Isabel Wilkerson's brilliant, brilliant book, Caste, in which she talked about that moment in the American South after the end of the Civil War and the early Reconstruction period, when there was this moment of possibility for mobilizing poor Blacks and poor whites in the South, and I think a political party in North Carolina that sought to do this and started winning. And that was the ultimate nightmare of the white exclusionary establishment, the white supremacist establishment in the South. And they found ways to redrive that wedge by pushing the identity narrative. We've got to make the narrative about economics and about economic inclusion and justice and opportunity. If we do that, we can create a broader coalition and prevail. But if it's just about, if the leading theme is an identity-based theme, we won't get wealthy people, who want to hang on to their tax breaks, and we'll lose a lot of lower income and working class people who, whose economic interests lie with a campaign of economic inclusion, but who can't sign on to an identity-based campaign.
You're a Bernie supporter, basically. I don't need to call you on that.
It's interesting, not quite, because Bernie, first of all, didn't quite reject the identity edge of this, and he was too radical for my taste. And anyone who calls themselves a socialist might as well just say, I'd like to lose the next presidential campaign. So packaging is very important. But I will say this, I think if the Democrats nominated someone with Bernie's instincts and ability to speak to the working class and make those issues leading issues, and use a little bit different language, and a little bit less scary extent of the policies, I think a lot of what Bernie represented was a winning formula. And if he could have attenuated it a bit in a few ways, I actually think he could have beaten Trump in 2016.
Yeah, I agree with that, because what he attempted to do, in my view, is like build this coalition. I wouldn't say a broader coalition, but a new coalition that builds transversally, as opposed to expand, what you already have, like redefining the terms of what the coalition is. And this is what you mean, if I take it correctly, like you need populism to fight populism. I don't know whether I agree conceptually with the formulation, but I'm going to take the spirit of that, because what it is ultimately, there's a political scientist, Argentine, Maria Esperanza Casullo, that works about, why populism works, basically why. And she says that, there are three characteristics. It constructs like a populist myth. It builds a we, it builds a harm that has been made to that we, and then it says why the leader can address that harm. But that may very well be within democracy, right? And if you build a coalition based on economic interest for the deprived, it's perfectly compatible with democracy, right?
Yeah, of course.
So you talk about in your article about the paradoxes, but you also have institutional proposals for change. Could you speak about those?
Well, sure. I mean, one is easy for me to talk about because probably a lot of our audience lives in San Francisco, so they know what ranked choice voting is. And I think that, you know, there's growing evidence that ranked choice voting is more democratic because it gives people more choice. Ultimately, I think if we get it on a larger scale, it will enable new political parties, certainly a Green Party and maybe the Libertarian Party, and not the Jill Stein Green Party. I'm saying more like the Green Party in Germany, that is a progressive, strong environmentalist party, but you know, not all the things I would like to say about Jill Stein, but I'll avoid saying now. Just not that far left, let's put it that way, but a more potentially competitive environmental party. And you know, with ranked choice voting, these other options, independence, whatever, you know, they can begin to get a hearing and get people's first preference votes because you're not wasting your vote. You vote for them first, and if they don't make it, you give your preference to your second candidate. And you know, as happened with London Breed in San Francisco, if no one gets a majority, votes are transferred until somebody wins. And that does tend to induce moderation and or at least pragmatism and broader coalition building, and to reduce polarization. I would go further at this point and try and encourage proportional representation in multi-member districts, combining it with ranked choice voting, so that we can have fair distribution, more scope for more ready and, you know, obvious scope for representation of women and minorities. Women are always represented in larger numbers in proportional representation systems. And you also get a fair situation. If we had PR in multi-member districts in the United States Congress, you wouldn't have a situation where, you know, you've got the congressional vote relatively evenly divided in North Carolina, but the Republicans win 10 of the 13 congressional seats, and the same thing in the reverse in Massachusetts and so on. So I would do that. I would definitely reform the Supreme Court. We are the only major democracy that gives life tenure to Supreme Court justices with no retirement limit. And so, you know, then they can serve 30 or 40 years. I think this is deeply undemocratic because, you know, society changes. But if someone's been on the court 30 years, you know, they may not change with the society. In any case, new presidents should have more predictable opportunities to appoint Supreme Court justices. I am strongly in favor of the general concept, which is present in a bill that Ro Khanna has co-sponsored, to impose an 18-year term limit on Supreme Court justices and give presidents the ability to nominate a justice every 2 years in the first and third years of their term. Then the nominee would go to the Senate, and the Senate would have to act on it. They could turn it down by a vote, but they couldn't bury it. And if they don't vote by a certain period of time, the nominee would be confirmed.
And this is, by the way, constitutional, because there's a clause in the Constitution that allows for this interpretation given that the Supreme Court would just go back to the federal justice system and not be out, because the
Exactly.
appointment
Well
is
stated.
for life in
Yeah.
the federal judicial system, but not necessarily in the Supreme Court.
That is a very important observation. There is a view that the Supreme Court might not interpret it that way. And then you've got the dilemma that the Supreme Court should probably disqualify itself because of a conflict of interest. They would be ruling on an issue involving their own tenure in office. But anyway, I think it's going to be very hard to get this bill through Congress.
Yes, and the other thing I wanted to just to speak about is like the national popular vote compound, that it is an initiative to actually do away with the electoral college, not by constitutional amendment, but by state legislation. Sorry.
Say again?
The national popular vote compact.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, that is a way of getting around the electoral college. If enough states accounting for a majority of the electoral college vote, 270 electoral votes, adopt this law that would require them to give their electoral college votes to the winner of the national popular vote and not necessarily the popular vote in their state. But we're stuck at, about 100 votes short of the 270 margin. And if you look at the politics of this, I think it will be difficult to get to 270. I favor it. It would be better than what we've got now, but it might be hard to achieve it anytime soon.
But the story you tell about Maine and ranked voting is so inspiring, I have to say. I was really moved, by the action of actual citizens, and that every person counts, and mobilizing, counts. I don't want to sound like romantic or idealistic, but it did happen. I have a last question before opening the floor to others. I have a lot of questions that I would indulge myself into. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, you said that, democracy is basically based on culture. And I wanted to ask your opinion because this country seems to be based culturally on the principles of the individual first, as opposed, tending more to the individual than the collective. But also about, state sovereignty and not, the national polity. It feels to be like a federal, arrangement, a covenant among sovereign states. And the weight put on individuals are their liberty and their responsibility as well. So how would you bridge those very strong cultural, issues when you have to build, a larger we? I don't know there's an answer for that, but if you don't have it, I don't know who does.
Yeah, you can't solve every problem. And sometimes you just need to move forward, understanding that your strategies will be imperfect, and you just do the best you can to square a circle.
Well, that's the answer. Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor, or I'm going to look at the chat.
And there are a couple that came for some reason direct message to me, so I should.
Okay, do you want to take them directly?
Yeah, sure. I will save the question of what to do until a little bit later. What's the cause of the current rise of Trumpism and polarization in the US and around the world? I think that there are multiple causes of polarization. I've alluded to some of them. I think one is certainly economic in nature, with psychological and social spillovers. And it has to do with deindustrialization and so globalization, people's loss of jobs and status and economic security, which is driving not only an angry retreat into conspiracy theories and anti-immigrant prejudice and triggering a lot of other really mean-spirited and xenophobic impulses, but is leading to despair in other respects in terms of the opioid crisis, the health crisis, the rising suicide rate among a lot of people in these deindustrializing areas. This is something else Osnos speaks to in his book, Wildlands. And if we don't address the twin problems of deindustrialization and loss of economic opportunity and jobs and failure to generate economic opportunity to replace it, and the separate but related problem of staggering concentrations of wealth and economic power, I don't think there's any way to turn this back, because it creates an atmosphere of such powerful anxiety that it makes people ripe for recruitment to conspiracy theories and populism and so much else. And you might say, well, if people are falling in status, losing their jobs, at the short end of a stick that is powerfully controlled by the 1,000 richest people in the country or whatever, who can have an obscene percentage of the total national wealth, then shouldn't they rally to the progressive cause? And the answer is often that's not the way it works. They're just as easily, if not more so, recruited as a result of the mobilization of identity, anxiety, and prejudice to right-wing and neo-fascist movements and causes. So we must address the economic underpinnings of this. At the same time, we have to deal with other factors that are driving this anxiety and that give fuel to the fire, raw material to the haters. And this involves the surge in violent crime and the feeling on the part of many citizens in Europe and the United States that their countries have lost control over their borders. I favor an open society. I favor generous immigration and amnesty laws. But I will tell you, as a political scientist, if we don't have some degree of effective control of our borders, Donald Trump will be president again, period, full stop. And so if I have to choose between having a president who's going to lead a slide toward authoritarianism, if not fascism, in America, on the one hand, and having Democrats in power who restrain, not eliminate, and not punish young immigrants who aren't at fault, but take steps to restrain illegal immigration, I have no doubt where I land. And I land the same way with a robust policy on fighting urban street crime, which is, I think, where London Breed is heading now, and so on. I mean, some of this is just common sense. Americans are not going to vote for a party that they think is not going to provide for their security, and that is even talking about defunding the police. So this is a second factor, the fear of insecurity and the way it's being mobilized. A third factor is social media, which, as you know, has all the wrong incentives, is really incentivizing outrage, fear, hatred, conspiracy theorizing, emotion rather than rationality. And we need some far-reaching regulation here to get the social media companies to make their algorithms transparent, to give people the power to control their own data and take it where they wish, and to try and put some brakes on the virality of what is being distributed. I think because of our First Amendment rights, there's a limit to the extent to which we can regulate content by government fiat, but I think a lot can be done to press the social media companies themselves to accept more responsibility for the content that they put on their sites. So, I mean, these are some of the drivers of Trumpism and polarization in the US and around the world. I might add that we know that there is a contagion effect, there is an imitation effect, or what social scientists call a diffusion and demonstration effect. And when political leaders elsewhere in the world see a political leader in a particular high-profile country having success with these kinds of cynical populist lines and strategies, fake news, and lack of rigged elections, and only I can fix it, and things like this, they do tend to copy one another and use a similar language and similar strategies of control and manipulation and domination. And so, unfortunately, I think Donald Trump's success has stimulated a lot of imitation among other would-be right-wing populists in the world, who are screaming now about fake news, stolen elections, and so on and so forth. And the US does have outsized influence in the world, and it is another reason why we need to be alarmed by what's happening and go to work on our own national situation. At the same time, I think we need to bring more pressure to bear on other countries that have been in the lead here in stimulating this, such as Hungary, which has continued to be subsidized by the European Union, even after trashing democratic culture and norms within the European Union.
Which is something that Carter did, back in '78, tying aid to respecting human rights and other things. I mean, it's interesting that in what you're saying, that sometimes institutions are not strong, or they are perceived to be strong only because they haven't been challenged. But once you challenge or you remove support, particularly by the elite, you show, the weakness. I mean, this is the work of Steve Levitsky that you mentioned, but with Daniel Brinks and Vicky Murillo. And this is, and this is the contagious kind of effect. They see that they can maybe challenge an institution and it looks strong, but it wasn't. It was that it was not challenged and they can get away with it. I had to make that comment because you inspired it, but let's go down. Do you want to read the next question or should I? You want to take a question?
There's a question here about, well, even if there's no big movement for single-sex bathrooms, et cetera, defund the police, the right wing will seize on that, use it. Well, it's true. They'll always try and invent things and swift boat, so to speak, the next Democratic presidential candidate. But you can't make it easy for them by giving them raw material and video, examples to use. And here, I think progressives need to call on their representatives, not only their territorial representatives, but people they respect and admire on the left in Congress and so on, to appeal to them to think about how their words will be heard and used by our political adversaries, and adversaries, I would argue, of democracy, most alarmingly. And I think the fact that this is going to happen to some extent anyway, doesn't mean that we're relieved of responsibility for the language we use and the way we frame our advocacy and campaigns and so on and so forth. And then another question I wanted to get to is, well, what can people do other than vote and give money to candidates? I think the political and electoral support is a pretty important thing. One of the articles that I published recently, yesterday, in American Purpose, notes that the three most important elections, I think, in 2024 are going to be for governor of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, where Whitmer and Evers will be running for re-election as governor of Michigan and Wisconsin, and there's an open seat, and the Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, will be running for governor of Pennsylvania on the Democratic ticket. If you presume that, as a mental exercise, that most states in 2024 will go the way they went in 2020, and that because of the laws that the Republicans are putting in place that will enable them to subvert the electoral process, that it could become much harder to win Georgia and Arizona, then, a Democratic presidential candidate may need to carry Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in order to win the Electoral College. And if Republicans gain control of the governorship in any of those three states, when they're pretty likely to retain control of the state legislature, both houses of the state legislature in each of those states, then that will enable them to rewrite the laws of electoral management and certification in ways similar to what Georgia did, and essentially, seize control of the electoral counting process and prevent a Democrat from winning the electoral votes of the state. So the best way to keep that subversion from happening is to hold on to those three governorships, and anything you can do to support the Democratic candidates in those races is very important. And then you've got Senate races in two of these three states and other swing states where, Democrats might well pick up seats. I think we're going to lose the House, but I think we've got a chance. I'm a Democrat, so I'm just speaking in that way. I think we've got a chance to actually not only retain control of the Senate, but pick up a seat or two. And, so the electoral realm is very important. But in addition, I think that continued advocacy for institutional change is, and for institutional defense, as in the Freedom to Vote Act, is really important here. And I want to celebrate the work of some of the institutions that are focused on that, like the Brennan Center for Justice, based in New York City, and the organization Protect Democracy, whose president lives right here in the Bay Area.
Those are great points. I want to go back to the point that you made about the electoral officers, that sometimes we elect officials and we don't know what their prerogatives are. And that is, for example, the Secretary of State, who's the ultimate electoral authority. So when we're electing, we really don't know that that's going to be, you know, if the chips come down, if I may use that expression, you know, the person, as it happened with Georgia, and it proved to be, you know, on the side of institutions and not on the partisan side, but that may not be the case, you know, in other circumstances. So there is, you know, the electoral support, and there's also, you know, redefining the discourse, if I may, you know, do a recap of what you said in terms of the support of democracy, and also redesign of institution, and supporting organizations that are supporting the Freedom to Vote Act, among others. You mentioned Protect Democracy. I've heard you speaking also about Leadership Now, No Labels. If you can talk about them. You also have a particular, you know, proposal for school boards and civic education. So if you can please convey, you know, those points, I would be thankful. We would all be.
Well, there's a whole wealth of organizations, grassroots civic organizations, that are working to defend electoral integrity and reform our democratic process in a way that would make it more functional and more fair. On the defense side, yes, you mentioned some others, Leadership Now. I would add Stacey Abrams' organization, Fair Fight for Electoral Fairness. Then you've got reform organizations like Unite Us or Unite US. Fair Vote, which is an organization that has been pushing proportional representation and ranked choice voting. Common Cause has been working for campaign finance reform, electoral reform, and so on. So there's an organization called Represent Us that played a critical role in the voter initiative that was passed in Alaska, of all states, that will implement ranked choice voting in the 2024 elections in Alaska. So there's so many organizations now that are really doing good work. On the more active front, yes, I think people all over the country need to think about volunteering to work at the polls, volunteering to become part of the citizen process of certifying elections and mobilizing and monitoring, mobilizing voters and monitoring voting. So it's not only people who want to subvert the vote that are doing the monitoring of the vote. One thing that's happened, if I can put it this way, is that I think a lot of the conspiratorial radical right, the very active pro-Trump right that has made clear its belief that the 2020 election results were illegitimate and fraudulent, and that has, if not supported, then condoned and partially legitimized the January 6th assault on the Congress. Many of these people have figured out the stress points in American democracy, the vulnerabilities in terms of election certification boards and other very arcane little niches where, we assume a mechanical and neutral, nonpartisan process would unfold to simply certify the will of the people. If this kind of mechanical and technical process is abandoned to people who do not wish well of democracy, then we'll be in very big trouble. So we have to pay attention to the details in various states. And of course, the problem that we face in California is it's not California we need to worry about, right? We don't face a serious threat of a hijacking or overturning of a free and fair election in California. This is the irony, that the people who are complaining now about democracy being at risk because of fraudulent elections are themselves the reason why we should worry about democracy being at risk, because they are the ones that want to overturn legitimate elections. And so in those states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, even Texas, Florida, and so on, where we can't be certain that, elections will be fairly and inclusively administered. Anyone who's been sitting on the fence has to be encouraged to come forward and volunteer to work in whatever pieces of the electoral administrative machinery might have a need for honest and fair-minded people.
Yes, that's a great point, because together with culture, or part of the culture that sustains democracy, you have to have good faith. But the institutions have to be strong enough when there is absence of good faith. And here the institutions are ill-suited for the lack of good faith in those respects. And very important one, I wanted to ask you I always say a last question, but don't you think that the events of last year can be understood as chickens coming home to roost, both, internationally? I mean, the US has been promoting democracy all over the world, but it has also promoted non-democracy all over the world. And also, the own racial, history of this country, and the two kind of, as to me, I was not surprised, but I'm a foreigner. I was not pleased, but I was not surprised. And that's how I felt it. What would you say to that? Or what do you think about that?
Well, it's an extremely interesting reflection. And let me respond to two pieces of it. First of all, I think generally that friends and colleagues of mine who, like you, Mara, come from countries that have had authoritarian experiences were less shocked than most Americans, simply because they've seen how democracy can be lost, right? And they've seen a Perón or a Chavez or a Putin or an Orban come to power by manipulating fear. And so they had, a framework for recognizing this and knowing that it wasn't unthinkable. So that's a very interesting observation you shared. In terms of what was the other part of the question you asked?
It's only that I saw, as this, built-in duality in the US, both internationally
about
and
promoting democracy.
right, and internally.
Yeah, so I wouldn't put it as chickens coming home to roost. I mean, that's the way China and Russia would like to put it, right? You've gotten what's coming to you now. There's no productivity in our flagellating ourselves that way. Yes, we've made terrible mistakes in our foreign policy, for example, by supporting and encouraging the 1973 coup in Chile, the coup to overthrow Mossadegh, probably the 64 coup in Brazil and others. And also in labeling the American occupation of Iraq a democracy building exercise when, that kind of undermines support for democracy promotion. But we've done a lot of good and I think noble work to support Democrats around the world. And the fact that we're now suffering such blatant deficiencies in democracy ourselves, I personally don't think should stop us from trying to use our resources to assist and support and seek solidarity with Democrats elsewhere in the world. The work still needs to go on. And so I think the lesson we should draw is humility in a different sense. Yes, we should be careful about lecturing to other countries in the world. There's an element of that, but do we really want to interpret that maxim? We should stop lecturing to countries around the world as we should stop complaining about China's cultural genocide against the Uyghur minority or the Tibetan people or the crushing of freedom in Hong Kong. I don't think that's a very defensible assertion. Or stop complaining about Putin's crushing of a free and fair election in Belarus or so on. The fact of our own democratic shortcomings and now serious problems shouldn't lead us to retreat into silence or shame in terms of responding to other injustices of democracy around the world, when solidarity and assistance with Democrats elsewhere can make a difference. They don't want our prescription or our tanks. They want our support. The other element of humility is to recognize that we are not only an imperfect democracy, I mean, that's always been true. We are an antiquated democracy. Our institutions are old and far behind the standards of, in some cases, most other well-functioning democracies in the world. The gold standard for electoral administration now is independent electoral administration. It's not having an elected Secretary of State be the chief electoral officer of the state, who's a member of a political party, or even having 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans certify the election. Why should any partisan official be involved in this? It should be neutral judges, nonpartisan officials who are walled off from partisan control. And so, but we are so resistant to change and to borrowing from more successful examples in the world that we don't have independent electoral administration truly anymore. It's disintegrating to the extent we had it. We don't have a national counter-corruption commission. We don't have a national human rights commission. We don't have a national or state level ombudsman. Maybe some cities have it. And we have, the horrible spectacle of a politicized judiciary in which we see what's happened with Supreme Court appointments and in which many judges have to run for re-election. What is the point under separation of powers of ever having a judge have to face the electorate. I cannot imagine a worse thing for the rule of law than a judge having to become a politician. A judge should be appointed for integrity and then have a fixed term, or maybe face a lengthy term that might, be subject to revalidation or not, but they should never have to be a politician. That's a bad thing in a democracy. And I could just go down the line. Our electoral system of first past the post, I've already spoken about, whether you want ranked choice voting purely, proportional representation. One person in their chat comment very smartly said, well, I don't like having a pure instant runoff. Speaking of Boudin winning as a minority choice candidate, well, you want to run off, fine, but not first past the post, something else that would require candidates to represent constituencies more broadly. So we need reform, and that is the respect in which we should draw humility from the current experience. But if the humility becomes passivity and leads us to retreat into despair, we're not going to defend democracy at home or abroad, and it's going to be a much darker period. So, we need to take it as a kind of set of marching orders for a new era of reform.
Thank you. I was gonna go into that direction. What I really like about what you said is humility and solidarity, which is a word that you don't usually hear. It's more ally than solidarity, but that kind of horizontal peer goes together with humility, not only internally, domestically, but also externally. And that could be kind of a discursive, pathway ahead, together with every single person counts. Every single person counts. So on that note, I would like to give you closing remarks and thank you immensely for this honor to have you here on this date, and for the call to action, your insights and your inspiration.
Oh, thank you so much, Mara. No, I would just close by saying, don't despair. It is not a useful reaction to the situation we're in. It's a natural one. It's a human one. But every time you're thinking that it's hopeless or too frightening to even think about any longer, go watch a movie, read a novel, enjoy the company of a friend or loved one, and get up in the morning and go back to work politically. Because first of all, there, as I said somewhere, I think in Ill Winds, there can be joy in the political struggle. Hubert Humphrey was known as the happy warrior, and during the civil rights and other progressive battles. And we have no choice. This is our country. I don't intend to leave it, even though my grandparents came from elsewhere and my father was born in Canada. But I don't want to live in Canada, even though I love Canada. I want to live in the United States, so I'm not going anywhere. And I think we should just roll up our sleeves and patiently and intelligently wage this battle.
Larry, thank you so much. It was truly an honor.
Okay.
So thank you so much, and I encourage everyone to join the discussion session later. Thank you, Larry. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.